What if Moses had not won all the spiritual battles he faced in Egypt? This question seems absurd to many, but what if I told you that the Bible hid more than it revealed about the spiritual struggle between the liberator of the Hebrews and the occult forces that dominated the most powerful empire of antiquity? What you know about the Egyptian gods may be just the tip of the iceberg. There is an African god, a powerful spiritual being, who allegedly confronted Moses directly and emerged victorious. Yes, this information may sound blasphemous at first glance, but before you judge, you need to hear what has been hidden for centuries. This is no longer a traditional Bible video. Here we will delve into a forgotten, silenced narrative, a spiritual mystery that remains alive to this day, hidden between the lines of sacred history and camouflaged by centuries of selective theology. While many see the plagues of Egypt as simple miracles of God, there is evidence that each was actually an open spiritual war between YHWH, the God of Israel, and the spiritual entities that reigned over Egypt. But among these entities was one figure who did not yield, who was not defeated, a mysterious African god, worshipped in the shadows, known by few, feared by many. In this video, you'll discover who this African god was who dared to confront Moses. You'll understand why this confrontation wasn't openly recorded in the Holy Scriptures and how this spiritual battle still resonates in the world today. What's more, we'll reveal the hidden behind-the-scenes details of an invisible war that many theologians have overlooked and which could completely change your perspective on the Bible, Egypt, and the true meaning of the Hebrews' liberation. Prepare to discover the hidden connections between Moses and the Egyptian priests, between miracles and magic, between the visible and invisible worlds. This is the kind of content few have the courage to share, but which you need to understand the depths of the biblical and African spiritual world. We're not talking about mythology. We're talking about deep spirituality, forbidden spiritual knowledge, texts that were excluded from the Bible, ancient traditions that remain alive among African peoples to this day, and mysteries that can shake your deepest religious beliefs. This is one of the most important videos you'll ever watch if you want to understand who really controlled Egypt in Moses' day. Because maybe, just maybe, Pharaoh wasn't the greatest enemy of liberation, but the spirit that guided him, an African god who refuses to be forgotten. Throughout this video, we will go through the spiritual evidence that shows that Moses faced more than one pharaoh. Who was this African god hidden by religious traditions? The reasons why the Bible and other sacred texts have silenced this part of history, and how this entity may be more present in today's world than we imagine. Now, before we continue, take a deep breath. What you're about to hear could change everything you think you know about the war between light and darkness, between God's prophets and the rulers of the spirit world. If you have the courage to dive where few dive, keep watching. If you have the courage to dive where few dive, keep watching. But before we move forward, I need to ask you something important. If this topic is already moving you in some way, if any part of this introduction has awakened a doubt, a memory, or even discomfort, then comment below. Your participation in the comments isn't just a way to strengthen this community, it's a way to give voice to your own spiritual quest. What do you think about this possible confrontation between Moses and an African god? Have you ever heard anything like it? Do you believe the Bible might have hidden something like this? This is a safe space for those seeking more than ready-made answers. Here we seek revelations. And of course, don't forget to like it right now. It seems simple, but it shows YouTube that this content is valuable and worth sharing. And with that, more people will be reached by this powerful message. If you are not yet subscribed to the channel, now is the time. Hit the subscribe button and activate the bell. We have a mission here: to unearth forgotten truths, reveal spiritual mysteries, and give voice to the invisible. If this kind of content resonates with you, then you're in the right place. Now yes, let's dive into the deepest part. Who was this African god? Where does he appear, and why was his story erased from the official narrative? Egypt in Moses' time was not just a political or military power. It was, above all, a territory completely dominated by an intense, complex spiritual atmosphere, deeply connected to the invisible world. Every stone, every river, every animal, every natural phenomenon was interpreted through the lens of divine forces and spiritual entities. The Egyptians did nothing without first consulting the gods. State decisions, healing rituals, battles, planting, births, even death. Everything was guided by instructions from the spiritual world. The people not only believed in multiple deities, they lived under the yoke of their powers. The pharaoh, for example, was not just a king. He was considered the incarnation of a living god. He was seen as the bridge between mortals and the Egyptian gods. And that is precisely why the confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh cannot be understood solely as a political clash. The liberation of the Hebrews was not just a matter of social justice. It was, in fact, an open spiritual war in which Moses represented the God of Israel, YHWH, while Pharaoh personified the spiritual authority of the African entities that reigned in that territory. And here begins the part few dare explore. Among the countless gods Egypt worshipped, there were some who weren't originally Egyptian. They came from deeper African regions, from ancient spiritual lineages, long before the construction of the pyramids. These deities were integrated into the Egyptian pantheon over centuries of religious syncretism. And one of these entities, whom you'll meet later in this video, had such a strong spiritual power that he didn't surrender even in the face of the 10 plagues. What we need to understand is that each of the plagues God sent to Egypt was not random. Each plague was a direct affront to a specific spiritual entity that dominated some aspect of Egyptian life. The Nile water turning to blood was a direct attack on the god Hapi, the deity of the river's floods. The darkness was an affront to the god Ra, the supposedly all-powerful sun god. The lice, the frogs, the death of the animals. None of this was random. Each strike was surgical, as if the God of Israel was saying, "I am stronger than all your gods. None of them can protect you." However, there is a strange absence in the biblical text. An entity is not mentioned. A spiritual force that appears in parallel texts, in African traditions, and in esoteric studies. A silent but persistent African god who remained standing even after all the plagues, as if to say, this war is not over yet. This spiritual being wasn't just interested in keeping the Hebrews physically enslaved. His mission was deeper. He wanted to enslave their spirits. He wanted to disrupt God's plan for the liberation of a people who would be a light unto the nations. And that's why many spiritual scholars believe that Moses' most difficult battle was not against Pharaoh, but against this African entity that worked behind the scenes, manipulating everything. This African deity, with ancient roots, was not visible to the common people, but she was invoked in secret chambers. Egyptian priests, trained from childhood in occult spiritual arts, learned to evoke her powers. Their practices involved incantations, sacrifices, prolonged meditation, the use of sacred symbols, and even the manipulation of the elements. Some say that some miracles performed by Pharaoh's magicians at the beginning of the Exodus story were performed with the direct help of this entity. Now think with me. If these magicians were able to turn staffs into serpents, water into blood, and reproduce some of the signs performed by Moses, were they merely imitating? Or were they actually channeling real spiritual power? Power from this hidden African god? This confrontation is no small matter. It is so serious that it changed the course of humanity's spiritual history. The liberation of the Hebrews was not just an act of divine justice, it was a cosmic rupture, a breakdown of spiritual authority. Moses was not just defying a human king, he was defying an invisible dominion structure, a spiritual pyramid that sustained one of the world's most powerful empires through the strength of African gods. And even today, there are regions of Africa where this god is worshipped under other names. He never ceased to exist in the spiritual realms. He simply changed form, name, and strategy. What was once practiced in Egyptian temples may now be disguised in modern spiritual practices, mystical philosophies, or even in some churches that have lost their connection with the truth. The spirit that once confronted Moses still acts today, and perhaps you feel it, even without knowing how to name it. The burning question is, why doesn't the Bible speak openly about him? Was he censored? Or was the text written to protect certain truths that only the spiritually awakened could discern? This absence raises more questions than answers, and perhaps that's precisely the purpose, to provoke a search. This silence, however, is not total. It whispers between the lines. It appears in details that escape the superficial reader. It reveals itself when we study the historical, spiritual, and cultural contexts of ancient Egypt in greater depth, and when we connect African traditions with non-canonized biblical records. Do you realize now that we're dealing with something much bigger than mere history? We're dealing with a spiritual conflict that still echoes, a profound mystery with eternal implications. And that's why, before we continue, I need to know, have you ever felt like there's something hidden behind the story of Moses that no one told you? Have you ever felt like the Bible hides more than it reveals? Comment below with the phrase, "There's something hidden in Egypt." If this part of the video made you think, write it down. This will help the video reach more people who are also seeking to understand the deeper spiritual layers of the Bible. And what's more, tell me, do you believe Moses really won all the battles? Or do you feel there's still something unresolved in this story? Share your opinion here in the comments. The next step is even deeper. We will delve into the spiritual descriptions of who this mysterious African god really was, what his name was, his function, and why his influence has spanned millennia to reach our days. Throughout history, many names have been remembered. Moses, of course, is one of the greatest icons of biblical spirituality. Pharaoh, symbol of oppression. Aaron, representative of the covenant. But there is one name that always seems to be hidden, a name that is never spoken, a presence that echoes in the background, but that few dare mention. The African god who confronted Moses. He doesn't appear in the best-known verses. He isn't on the list of pharaohs. He isn't in the pages of the most popular sacred books. But he was there. He was invoked. He was feared. He fought. And according to some traditions, he won a silent spiritual battle that continues to this day. We're not talking about a fictional character. We're talking about an entity mentioned in African oral traditions, discreetly cited in apocryphal texts, and studied by the few mystics and scholars who dared to break the veil of the institutionalized religious system. His name was whispered in secret rituals. Some called him Nkulu, others Obaluaye. In certain regions he was associated with Seth. In others he was confused with Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom. But the consensus among these sources is that he was no ordinary god. He was the guardian of spiritual transitions, the one who opens and closes pathways between worlds, between dimensions, between eras. Unlike other African gods syncretized and peacefully integrated into Egyptian mythology, this entity had a confrontational function. He was a spiritual blocking force. His mission was to prevent certain revelations from reaching humanity, and upon realizing that the God of Israel was directly intervening in history, liberating a people, breaking cycles of spiritual oppression, and shattering the hegemony of local gods, this entity rose up. She didn't reveal herself openly. Like almost every spirit of high strategic importance, she operated in the shadows. She used the Egyptian magicians as channels. She acted through signs, visions, curses, and astral manipulations. This is why Moses' first miracles were immediately imitated by the magicians, because they weren't mere tricks. They were real spiritual manifestations. And the force behind these men was much older than we imagine. There are passages from the book of Jasher, a text mentioned twice in the Bible itself, but not part of the traditional canon, that contain descriptions of entities that guided Pharaoh's wise men. One of them is called Zetan, a spirit who ruled the elements of the earth and who spoke through statues enshrined in hidden chambers of the palace. There are also fragments of Gnostic manuscripts found in Egypt that speak of a sand god, or lord of the southern storms, who resisted the Hebrew God and predicted that his people would return to slavery in the future. For many scholars of African spirituality, these descriptions are not symbolic. They are real references to an entity that Christianity and Judaism chose to ignore. And here lies the central question: why was this figure erased from the official biblical texts? The answer may be disturbing. It involves religious politics, narrative control, strategies of spiritual power, and the selective construction of what would be considered inspired by God. During the councils that defined what would and would not enter the canon of Scripture, many texts were discarded, labeled as heretical, occult, and dangerous. And not because they contained lies, but because they contained truths that could not be spoken. Imagine the impact of recognizing that Moses, the Bible's greatest liberator, faced a spiritual entity that was not completely defeated. Imagine how this would shake the foundations of theologies that claim that all evil was defeated right there. It's not convenient to acknowledge that there are spiritual forces that the biblical text itself preferred to leave in the shadows. But that doesn't mean they don't exist. They are there, in the dark corners of sacred history, waiting to be rediscovered by those brave enough to look beyond the surface. And there's more. Some African spiritual lineages still make direct reference to this being. In rituals led by elders south of the Sahara, there is talk of a spirit that challenged the Hebrew liberator, an entity associated with sand and wind, who still demands offerings and pacts. In the accounts of the Dogon people, there are references to Amo-Olu, an entity that descended into the underground temples and taught the Egyptian priests how to resist the plagues. These traditions, though rejected by Western Christianity, have survived the test of time because they carry ancient truths. Truths that the Bible didn't deny, it just didn't record. What does this mean for us today? That we may still be facing the consequences of this unfinished battle. That this entity may remain active, influencing structures of spiritual domination, preventing liberation, manipulating emotions, and blocking divine access in the lives of people who don't even realize they're under ancestral spiritual influence. The past isn't dead, it's simply changed form. And here something very profound comes into play. Perhaps the Bible's very silence about this African god is a message. Perhaps the Spirit of God has left clues so that only those who truly seek will find them. Because the kingdom of heaven, as Jesus said, is not given to those who merely listen, but to those who dig, who search, who are not content with the surface, who ask questions, who are indignant, who seek revelations. And you, are you among them? If this part of the video awakened something within you, if you felt like you were hearing something you already knew, even without having ever read it, then comment below with the phrase, "Shadows also have a voice." This simple sentence will show me that you're following this spiritual dive into the depths, that you're not here just out of curiosity, but because you sense something bigger hidden in this story. And I also want to know, what's your opinion on the texts that were excluded from the Bible? Do you think there are spiritual truths that were purposefully suppressed? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'll read them all. This is our space, a community of spiritual seekers, of people who know that faith doesn't have to be blind. It can be lucid, profound, and bold. Now take a deep breath, because what comes next may shake everything you believe about the plagues of Egypt. After all, what if each one wasn't just a sign, but a direct response to coordinated spiritual attacks by ancient entities? Everything you've known so far was merely a foreshadowing of a confrontation that almost no one has dared to name for what it truly was. An invisible spiritual battle fought between heaven and the underworld, between Moses and an African entity who refused to surrender Egypt to the God of Israel. And this battle didn't take place with swords, nor armies, nor spears. It took place in another dimension, in a spiritual realm where words carry more weight than steel, where the signs of power are not physical, but cosmic, profound, and chilling. When Moses entered Egypt with a staff in one hand and divine command in the other, he knew he was facing more than just a ruler. He carried within him the revelation that his mission was to liberate not just enslaved bodies, but minds oppressed by ancient spiritual pacts, sealed by generations who didn't even understand what they were carrying. Therefore, the confrontation with Pharaoh became, from the very first encounters, something much greater than simple diplomacy. Because behind every "no," Pharaoh said, there was an entity whispering, "These slaves are mine." And this is precisely where we need to open our spiritual eyes. We can no longer read this passage of Scripture as a simple historical plot. What happened there was a clash between spiritual realms, and Moses was not alone. The God of Israel accompanied him, but on the opposite side, an ancient and powerful spirit resisted in silence, manipulating Pharaoh's words, inspiring the magicians, activating forces that could not be seen, but felt in every plague, in every denial, in every hardening of heart. The battle was manifested in signs. Moses threw his staff on the ground. It turned into a serpent. Pharaoh's magicians did the same. Serpents also appeared on their side, but there's something hidden in this scene. The text says that Moses' serpent devoured the others, but what does this mean in spiritual language? The serpent was one of the ultimate symbols of Egyptian spiritual power. It was a symbol of wisdom, protection, and dominion. When Moses confronts serpents with serpents, it shows that he came not just with a sign, but with the authority to confront the Egyptian spiritual system itself. And yet, serpents appeared on both sides. This cannot be ignored. The magicians weren't playing tricks. They were using ancient spiritual powers. And if these powers were activated, it was because someone or something allowed them. From then on, Moses' every step was followed by spiritual resistance. When the waters turned to blood, it wasn't just a physical event, it was a denunciation, it was a spiritual message. The Nile was worshipped as a god. It was a source of life, fertility, and prosperity. Turning the Nile into blood was like symbolically murdering the deity that sustained Egypt. It was a sentence. But even in the face of this, Pharaoh didn't give in. What kept him so secure, so confident, so blind? One man's stubbornness doesn't explain it. There was something behind it. There was a spiritual influence that strengthened him in his rebellion. And here, once again, we find the trace of the hidden African god. He did not manifest himself with thunder, nor did he speak in an audible voice. His actions were subtle, but lethal. He inspired the magicians. He counseled the priests. He fed the Pharaoh's dreams with visions of eternal power. He said, "They shall not go out." And all the while, Moses advanced plague after plague, striking not only Egypt, but Egypt's gods, and among them this ancestral spirit that refused to fall. Other biblical stories show us similar conflicts. When Daniel prays for 21 days and no answer comes, the angel sent to him says he was prevented by a spiritual prince of Persia until the archangel Michael comes to help. This clearly shows that there are regional spiritual hierarchies that dominate entire territories. They have authority, they resist, they delay. And if this happened to Daniel, why wouldn't it have happened to Moses? If there is a spiritual prince over Persia, why wouldn't there be one over Egypt? And furthermore, if this spiritual prince has not yet been completely defeated, Could he still be operating behind the scenes in African nations, influencing governments, religions, and traditions? The Bible gives us glimpses of these conflicts. Behind the scenes in the book of Job, we see a conversation between God and Satan, where the enemy presents himself as someone who walks through the earth and roams throughout it. This reveals that the spiritual world is in constant motion, constantly engaged in wars unseen by our eyes. And if this is true, then every action Moses took was also a reaction to something happening in the unseen. He wasn't just obeying orders. He was confronting an invisible structure that desired to maintain spiritual dominion over an entire nation. This structure was sustained by ancient pacts made with blood, sacrifices, cursed words, and forgotten rituals. Many of these pacts did not directly involve the Hebrew people, but they affected them. They were living on land consecrated to gods who did not want them free. The war, then, was territorial. Moses wanted to lead the people to Canaan, but Egypt wanted to keep them not just as servants, but as spiritual prisoners. Imagine this with me, a multitude enslaved for centuries, without identity, without strength, without hope, and suddenly a man appears, claiming that God wants to free them, but what he finds is a system that goes beyond chains. He finds an empire sustained by spiritual alliances, by enchantments, by occult manipulations. And what no one says is that the greatest battle Moses fought was not with Pharaoh, but with the spirit behind him. This spirit still acts. It still speaks. It still whispers in ears willing to hear power rather than submission. It still manifests itself in religious systems that control rather than liberate. It still operates in spiritual environments that favor fear over faith, dominion over grace. It disguises itself. It changes its name. But its essence is the same: to block the advancement of God's plan. And maybe, just maybe, He's also trying to block something in your life. If this content is making you see the story of Exodus in a different light, comment below. Not every battle is visible. Write this down. Mark this moment. Share with me what you're feeling. Have you ever experienced moments when you felt like you were facing something invisible, yet very real? Have you ever felt like you were fighting something greater than your circumstances? Tell me in the comments. This channel is a community of revelation, and your story might inspire someone. What we traditionally call the 10 plagues of Egypt is perhaps one of the greatest spiritual codes the Bible has ever presented. Most people read these plagues as random acts of judgment, as powerful signs sent by God to force Pharaoh to free the Hebrew people. But what if each one was actually a surgical, intentional strike, a direct blow against a specific deity who spiritually ruled Egypt? What if behind each plague lay a hidden confrontation between the God of Israel and the African pantheon manifesting in Egypt? To understand this, we must go beyond the surface of the narrative and enter the spiritual environment in which these plagues occurred. They were not simply manifestations of divine wrath. Each plague had a shape, a focus, a target. And strangely, these spiritual targets coincided with the most revered Egyptian gods. It was no coincidence. It was a confrontation. The Nile water turning to blood, for example, was the first sign, and perhaps the most spiritually impactful. The Nile was much more than a river. It was considered a living entity. Hapi, the god of the Nile, was worshipped as the source of life, fertility, and harvests. He was the one who brought the annual floods that guaranteed food for the people. When God turns the Nile to blood, He's not just performing a miracle. He's declaring that the god Hapi's life has been drained. It was an act of spiritual dishonor, an open confrontation. Then come the frogs. It may seem strange, even funny, But the plague of frogs also has a deep spiritual connection. The Egyptians worshipped the goddess Heket, represented as a woman with a frog's head, a symbol of fertility, birth, and the creation of life. Frogs were sacred and protected. So when they multiply chaotically, invading homes, beds, kitchens, utensils, transforming the sacred into plagues, what's happening there is the symbolic degradation of divinity. God is demonstrating that he has power over even the most revered symbols of that religion. Then the lice appear, an attack on the body, an uncontrollable nuisance. And the most interesting thing is that Pharaoh's magicians cannot reproduce this sign. It's the first time they admit, this is the finger of God. Do you know why? Because Egyptian priests needed to maintain ritual purity to invoke their gods. With their bodies infested with lice, they became impure, unfit for worship. It was as if God was severing their connection to the spiritual world. They could no longer invoke their entities. They could no longer offer sacrifices. The bridge between them and the African gods had been broken. The plague of flies comes soon after, and this is another direct attack. There was a god named Khepri, represented by a scarab, a type of beetle, who symbolized renewal, the cycle of life, and the sunrise. The multiplication of filthy insects over Egypt was an act of spiritual mockery. It was as if God himself were saying, "Do you want to worship insects? Then you will be dominated by them." Holiness was transformed into filth. The symbol of order turned to chaos, and the plagues continue, each more intense than the last. The death of the animals, a direct attack on the gods represented by bulls and cows, such as Apis and Hathor. The wounds on the bodies, an affront to Imhotep, considered the god of medicine and healing. The rain of stones and fire from the sky, a direct challenge to the god nut of the atmosphere and celestial protection, and the total darkness for 3 days. This was perhaps the most humiliating blow, because Ra, the sun god, was the greatest of all in the Egyptian pantheon. He was the supreme god, the father of the gods. When the sun goes out, when the sky closes, when the light disappears, what God is saying to Egypt is, "Your greatest god has fallen silent. I have defeated him." But what leads us to believe this was more than coincidence is that the Egyptians themselves began to fear not the plagues themselves, but the name of YHWH. Something changed. The nation's spiritual consciousness was shattered. There was now a conviction that the God of Moses was not a tribal spirit, a mad prophet, or a skilled sorcerer. They understood they were facing a God who placed himself above their own, a God who challenged every African entity they had worshipped for generations. And it is at this point that we need to open our eyes to what was really happening. The plagues were not punishments. They were coded spiritual messages, weapons of a silent war between deities. And even if Moses was the visible messenger, what was being waged there was a war between spiritual realms, a war between the true God and the entities that had dominated Egypt for centuries. Each blow was like a sentence, a spiritual, "It is finished," a public declaration of defeat to the hidden gods. But were all the deities struck? Were none of them left standing? This is where the Bible's silence becomes unsettling, because there are absences in the text that scream louder than words. There are entities that are not mentioned, even though they were widely known and worshipped in Egypt at that time. And here, once again, comes the hidden African god, the one who remained on the sidelines of the plagues, who was not mentioned, who was not exposed, who perhaps, due to his cunning and spiritual nature, resisted in silence, hidden behind the others, biding his time. Was he not directly attacked? Or was his role not one that could be overcome with visible signs? Perhaps this god was the most dangerous of all, because he acted not on the body, nor on the earth, nor on the atmosphere, but on the minds and spirits of the people. A manipulator, a spirit of hidden resistance. an invisible war god who continued to hold Egypt under his sway even after the public defeat of the others. This theory leads us to understand that not all deliverance is visible, and that even when God's people advance, there are still battles in the spiritual world that need to be won with discernment, depth, and revelation. It's not just a matter of seeing the plagues and saying God won. It's about understanding who was affected and who still remains active. If this reflection touched you, comment below. Each plague had a target. Write this in the comments so I know you're walking with me on this journey of revelation. I really want to know, which plague impacted you most spiritually? Which one do you think most symbolizes the fall of a specific god? Tell me. Your opinion matters. Here, you're part of the conversation. Behind the liberation of the Hebrews, behind the plagues, behind the triumphant departure from Egypt, behind the Red Sea parting and the people walking on dry land, there is a silence. A deep, uncomfortable, spiritual silence. It's the kind of silence that doesn't appear in speeches, that isn't in hymns, that isn't taught in Sunday school. It's the silence that carries the question few dare ask. Did Moses really win all the spiritual battles he faced in Egypt? Yes, he freed the people. Yes, Pharaoh relented. Yes, the plagues stopped. But what about that African god? The one who worked in the shadows, the one who wasn't named, wasn't publicly overthrown, wasn't exposed like the others. This is precisely where many scholars of ancient spiritual traditions assert that not every victory is total, not every liberation complete. Sometimes people emerge from slavery, but they carry with them invisible marks, spiritual inheritances, unconscious pacts, ancient practices that continue to shape behavior for generations. And if we carefully observe the behavior of the people of Israel after the Exodus, we will realize that Egypt left their hands, but it did not leave their hearts. At various times they murmur, wanting to return, missing the food, the customs, the land of slavery. This is not just physical deprivation. This is a spiritual echo. It's as if a part of them is still connected to that land and more deeply to the spirits that dominated that territory. And here we enter a delicate and at the same time revealing point. There is spiritual and symbolic evidence that an African god resisted to the end and left his mark on the people. This entity didn't need to keep the Hebrews' bodies captive. It was enough to touch their minds, influence their culture, infiltrate their practices and thoughts. And that's exactly what began to happen in the desert. Even after seeing the sea part, the people build a golden calf and bow down before it. A seemingly impulsive act, but one that reveals something much deeper, the presence of an Egyptian spiritual culture still active within them. And don't think this calf was created out of thin air. It represents a symbol of Egyptian worship, a direct reflection of African entities associated with fertility, power, and protection. The deity known as Apis, a sacred bull, was worshipped with rituals involving gold, dance, and festivities. What the people did in the desert wasn't just disobedience, it was a spiritual return to Egyptian practices. And this return indicates that some spiritual force survived the crossing. This is why some scholars, particularly those in more mystical and spiritual fields, argue that there was a hidden victory on the other side. While Moses thought he had broken with Egypt, Egypt was silently infiltrating the people. The confrontation that seemed resolved was actually merely changing form. And this pattern would be repeated many times in biblical history. Idolatry, syncretism, occult practices, alliances with people of different spiritual cultures. All of this points to a continuous spiritual resistance that was not completely broken in Egypt. And it doesn't stop there. Over the centuries, even after entering the Promised Land, the Hebrews continued to struggle against external spiritual influences. At times, it seemed as if they were reliving the same cycles as Egypt. And some spiritual leaders claim this is the result of a spiritual portal that was never closed. The door was opened in Egypt, a powerful African entity manifested, confronted Moses, lost partly, but was not completely banished. And as long as this door remains open, the spiritual influence continues to pass on, generation after generation. Now think with me, if this entity has not been defeated, where is it now? Has it manifested itself in other cultures? Has it hidden behind new names, new forms, new philosophies? Does it still operate within modern religious systems? This possibility forces us to rethink how we read the Bible. Perhaps behind stories of idolatry, rebellion, and spiritual confusion lie traces of the same presence that confronted Moses in the days of Egypt. And there's something even more impressive. Many spiritual practices of African origin remained present even after the Exodus. Some were absorbed, adapted, and transformed. Others remained intact, carried by peoples, transmitted through generations, and today still manifest themselves in rituals, songs, traditions, and even in some contemporary religious expressions. There is a spiritual heritage that has not been erased, just disguised. And this brings us to a key point. It's not enough to escape physical slavery. We must break free from spiritual slavery. And this break doesn't happen just with miracles and signs. It requires revelation, awareness, and direct confrontation with the forces that still try to dominate the soul. Moses started this war, but perhaps the responsibility for ending it has been passed on to us. Have you ever stopped to wonder why certain regions of the world experience repetitive cycles of suffering, idolatry, and spiritual confusion? Have you ever noticed how some systems seem to always be under invisible control? Perhaps it's the trace of that ancient confrontation, that battle between Moses and the African god who refused to be erased from history. And here comes a spiritual warning. The war is not over yet. And until it is acknowledged, confronted, and exposed, this spirit will continue to operate in the cracks. That's why this type of content needs to be talked about. It needs to be taught. It needs to be shared. Because those who don't know the root of the problem are simply pruning the branches. If this part of the video resonates with you, comment below. Liberation must be complete. Write this if you believe there are apparent spiritual victories, but that the real war continues in the unseen. Tell me in the comments, have you ever felt free in some areas of your life, but realized there was still something holding you back spiritually? Share with me. At this point, perhaps the most disturbing question echoing within you is, why doesn't the Bible speak openly about this spiritual battle between Moses and this hidden African god? How is it possible that such a profound war, so laden with spiritual symbols and eternal consequences, has been relegated to subtext, to whispers, to symbols that only those with trained eyes can see? Is this merely an editorial accident, a limitation of the text? Or are we facing a deliberate strategy, spiritual, doctrinal, and even political, to keep certain mysteries out of the reach of the masses? From the very beginning of the biblical canon's formation, there were disputes between what was considered inspired and what was seen as too dangerous. Many decisions were made not solely based on spiritual revelation, but also based on institutional, religious, and geopolitical interests. History shows us that several books were excluded, erased, suppressed. Writings considered apocryphal, pseudepigraphic, Gnostic, or simply inconvenient were left aside. But were these books excluded because they lacked truth, or because they contained too much truth, truth that jeopardized the spiritual control exercised by the religious authorities of the time? This is the great tension between what we call divine revelation and doctrinal control. There is a limit drawn by men to what can and cannot be taught, read, and disseminated. And when we observe the Bible's glaring silence about this African spiritual entity that confronted Moses, it is impossible not to think of spiritual censorship. A censorship that may have been motivated by fear, ignorance, or strategy. Imagine the impact of openly admitting that Moses, Israel's greatest liberator, not only faced Pharaoh, but also an African god who was not completely defeated. That this entity survived, left a legacy, and continues to influence cultures to this day. This information, if clearly written in sacred texts, would completely change the narrative. Churches would have to reformulate their teachings on liberation, spiritual warfare, and idolatry. Theologies would need to admit that there are spiritual forces that have not been completely defeated and that still need to be confronted by an awakened generation. But instead, we have a sacred text that chooses silence. That falls silent precisely where we expected a cry. The lack of direct mention of the African god is not just a detail, it is a strategic gap. And this silence, when examined closely, speaks louder than many verses. It raises questions, it disturbs, it provokes, and perhaps this is its true purpose, to encourage only those who thirst for absolute truth to venture beyond the obvious. And this is where the so-called non-canonized books come in. Writings such as the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jasher, the Book of Jubilees, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and various Gnostic texts found at Nag Hammadi in Egypt. These writings speak of spiritual battles, rebelling entities, territorial dominions, and hierarchies of the invisible world. They are not read in churches. They are not taught in seminaries. Many are considered dangerous. Adut, but is it the error that makes them dangerous, or the truth they contain? Some of these texts mention the names of spirits, gods, and powers that influence kingdoms and nations. Others describe confrontations between prophets and entities that do not appear in official books. There are entire passages that speak of hidden priests, ancestral pacts, and battles that have not yet ended. And many of these accounts match symbols and behaviors described in Scripture, although without naming them directly. The problem is that institutionalized religion has always feared the unknown. And anything that can't be controlled, labeled, or systematized becomes a threat. Therefore, throughout history, there has been an effort to simplify the Bible, to make it accessible but also safe. And in this process, mysteries were pruned, areas of tension were softened, names were erased. And the result was a version of history that does indeed contain truths, but partial truths, limited to those that don't challenge the system. But what happens to those who feel something is missing? Who, even after years in church reading the Bible, praying, still feel there are gaps, that there are untold stories, unexplained battles, uncomfortable silences? These are the seekers, those who refuse to accept that everything has already been revealed. Those who know that the kingdom of God is not in printed words alone, but in the ongoing revelation of the Spirit. And if this is your case, if you sense there's something greater behind what's written, then perhaps you're ready to understand that the Bible's silence wasn't a mistake, but a divine provocation, an invitation to go further, to dig deeper, to decipher the symbols, to discern the gaps. Because it's in this silence that the deepest mysteries lie hidden. Jesus himself spoke in parables, and he often said, "He who has ears, let him hear." This means that not everything was for everyone. Some spiritual truths require maturity, hunger, boldness, and perhaps, just perhaps, the battle between Moses and the African god was recorded exactly like this, as a shadow, an absence, an enigma, so that only true seekers can find it. Can you understand what this means? If this part of the video brought you this feeling of holy restlessness, comment below, "Silence also speaks." Write this sentence if you felt that the Bible can indeed hide profound mysteries that have yet to be revealed. And tell me in the comments, have you ever felt that certain topics were purposefully erased? Have you ever felt that there are greater truths that have been silenced by fear or control? Share. I want to hear from you. You're part of something bigger. In the next section, we'll reveal how the spiritual legacy of this African god remains active today in religions, cultures, and even in some modern Christian movements. What follows may shock you, but it will set you free. If there's one mystery that troubles those thirsting for revelation, it's this. What if the African god who confronted Moses wasn't just an entity from the past? What if he not only survived, but is preparing to return, not in physical form, not as a folkloric apparition, but as a global spiritual influence, camouflaged in systems, camouflaged in religions, in cultural movements, even in discourses that seem peaceful, liberating, and harmless? There are spiritual currents, esoteric prophecies, and ancestral traditions that boldly affirm the African god of spiritual warfare is returning, and he's not coming alone. This idea, which seems absurd at first glance, begins to make sense when we look at the signs of our times. There is a clear resurgence of spiritual practices linked to African roots. In many countries, especially in the Americas and Europe, a growing number of people are seeking connection with spiritualities that were, until recently, forgotten or marginalized. Rituals, offerings, cults, and celebrations of ancestral entities are becoming commonplace again. What was once practiced behind the scenes now gains prominence, visibility, and prestige. But what few realize is that this resurgence is not just cultural, it is spiritual. Some leaders of these modern spiritual lines claim that a major reactivation of spiritual portals is underway. They believe that entities that have been silenced for centuries are re-emergence now with greater strength, influence, and access. Among these entities, there are specific mentions of a figure who allegedly confronted Moses, an ancestral spirit, guardian of the boundaries between worlds, who returns in the last days to reclaim his dominion. In some traditions, he is described as the forgotten watchman, the king of cyclical time, the spirit who reclaims what was sealed, a description eerily similar to what we identify in the traces left in Egypt. Now imagine with me, if this spirit managed to infiltrate the minds of the Hebrew people even after their liberation, and if this influence spanned generations, adapting to different historical contexts, why would it be difficult to accept that it could also manifest itself in the modern era, under new guises, new discourses, new banners? The spiritual world is not static. It moves, it updates itself. It knows how to use time and human structures as instruments. And that's why, behind the scenes of current history, we may be witnessing not just a cultural awakening, but an organized attempt at a spiritual return. This return isn't happening through physical wars, but through ideas, symbols, art, music, education, and even social movements. It's no coincidence that so many systems are promoting a kind of liberation that in reality disconnects people from biblical spiritual truth and binds them to occult practices disguised as empowerment. And here lies the most critical point. The spiritual war between light and darkness has never been as subtle as it is now. In ancient times, African, Egyptian, and Babylonian gods demanded explicit sacrifices. Today, they feed on ignorance, on distraction, on spiritual emptiness, on the cult of the self, on the relativization of good and evil. They no longer need to appear under ancient names. It is enough for their essences to remain operating behind the scenes, and they do. Several esoteric authors have written about the return of dormant spiritual entities. Some speak of ancestral lineages awakening. Others mention a new era of reconnection with the ancient gods. They don't use Christian language. They don't speak of spiritual warfare, but deep down, they're referring to the same phenomenon, an invisible battle where entities that were confronted in the past are reorganizing for the last days. And don't think this is an exaggeration. Just look at the growing fascination with the occult, alternative spirituality, ancient religions, and syncretic cults. There is a thirst for spiritual connection, but this thirst is being quenched by contaminated sources. Sources that promise freedom, but imprison. Sources that speak of love, but reject truth. Sources that speak of power, but ignore the cross. It is in this atmosphere that the return of this African god becomes possible. Because he doesn't need to be accepted as a god. He just needs to be celebrated as a symbol, as a culture, as an archetype. And thus, his influence spreads unnoticed. And now, think with me courageously. Could it be that the Bible doesn't mention this return because it's part of humanity's final cycle of spiritual trials? Could it be that, just as in the days of Moses, this entity is preparing a new siege, not against a nation, but against an entire generation? A distracted, inattentive, spiritually vulnerable generation, a generation that calls light darkness and darkness light. If the confrontation between Moses and this entity represented the beginning of a liberation, perhaps its return represents the last great attempt at spiritual imprisonment before Christ's return. And if this is indeed the case, then our responsibility is even greater. We need to be alert. We need to discern. We need to prepare our spirits, because what's at stake isn't just culture or tradition. It's the eternal destiny of souls. The Bible says that in the last days, deceiving spirits, doctrines of demons, false prophets, and spiritual manifestations would arise that would confuse even the elect, if possible. This is happening. It's before our eyes. And perhaps one of the biggest names behind this curtain is precisely the one who challenged Moses in Egypt, and who now returns, cloaked in ancient wisdom, to seduce the unwary. Do you feel it? If this content touched something inside you, comment below, "I will not be fooled." Write this sentence if you believe the Holy Spirit is awakening you to discern the times and spiritual movements. And tell me, have you ever noticed these influences disguised in seemingly innocent things? Have you ever felt that there's something behind certain speeches and movements that tries to lead people away from the truth? After everything you've heard so far, you might be asking yourself, but what does this change in practice, in my spiritual life, in my way of seeing the Bible, the story of Moses, and even my own faith? And that's precisely where the most powerful twist of this revelation lies, because we're not just unearthing a hidden confrontation between Moses and an ancient African god. We're not just talking about forgotten traditions, erased texts, or spiritual theories. We're talking about you. Yes, you, who may be living today an updated version of this invisible battle. The question I need to ask you now is direct yet disconcerting. Are you also fighting an invisible god inherited from past generations? It may seem strange to think this way, but stop and observe. How often do you feel like you're fighting battles that didn't start with you? How many times have you found yourself facing repetitive patterns, old fears, spiritual impulses you don't know where they come from? Perhaps they're feelings, behaviors, or even spiritual blocks that make no rational sense, but that paralyze, sabotage, and confuse you. What if I told you that many of these struggles aren't just yours? That perhaps you're unknowingly carrying inherited spiritual battles fueled by previous generations? Silent spiritual inheritances, ancestral influences that continue to operate like invisible voices deep within your soul. Voices that tell you, you won't move forward, you're not worthy, you belong to the system. Spiritual slavery is safer than freedom. These voices aren't random. They're the echo of a war that began long before you were born. A war that spanned Moses, Egypt, the plagues, the deserts, the temples, family traditions, and now it's reached you. And the worst part is that most of the time, it's disguised. It doesn't appear as a spiritual battle. It presents itself as routine, as fatigue, as stagnation, as distraction, as empty religiosity. But deep down, it's a deep spiritual resistance that wants to prevent you from truly breaking through. And maybe now you understand why, even praying, even fasting, even going to church, you still feel like something is holding you back, as if there's a spiritual cycle you can't break. An invisible wall you don't know how to cross. This is real. This is war, and it needs to be discerned. The story of Moses is not just about a liberator who led a people out of Egypt. It is, in fact, a spiritual mirror of the liberation process we all need to experience, because Egypt is more than a geographic location. It is a spiritual state. It is the place where hidden gods operate silently, where ancient pacts still hold sway, where slavery disguised as stability has kept people trapped for generations. And leaving Egypt is not just a matter of changing environments. It is a spiritual transformation that requires revelation, rupture, and repositioning. And Moses, oh Moses, the image we often have of him is that of an unshakable hero, a perfect leader, a man who won every battle. But what if he also faced struggles he couldn't overcome? What if the Bible's silence about certain spiritual confrontations is precisely an invitation for us to understand that even the greatest men of God faced silent wars that left their mark, not so that we would idolize them, but so that we would know that we too are in this struggle and that it is real. What we're building here together in this video is more than a historical analysis. It's a spiritual summons, a divine provocation for you to look deeply at your faith journey and ask yourself, what still holds me back? What within me is still connected to Egypt? What voices have I inherited that still shape my choices? What spiritual covenants were made before me and continue to operate now? These aren't easy questions, but they are necessary. And maybe, just maybe, that's why the Bible is silent on certain things, because not everything holy comes ready-made. Some revelations only come to those who have the courage to dig, those who hear the call and delve deep, those who aren't content with ready-made answers but hunger for the truth. Perhaps that's why Jesus said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Not a superficial truth, but the truth that reveals the roots, the invisible structures, the covenants that need to be broken. And when you begin to see this, everything changes. You realize that faith isn't just a belief system, it's a battlefield, a territory where spiritual forces fight every day for your mind, your heart, your destiny. And ignoring this reality is the first step to defeat, but discerning it is the first step to victory. So I invite you to say a silent prayer right where you are right now. It doesn't have to be pretty or perfect, but let it be honest. Let it come from the depths of your spirit, something like, "Lord, if there are spiritual inheritances that bind me, reveal them to me. If there are pacts I carry without knowing it, show them to me. If there are ancestral voices that still hold power over me, I want to break them. I want to be free, truly free." And if this word is revealing something to you, if it is touching you in a way you have never felt before, comment below, "I want to break with the invisible spiritual inheritances." Write this in the comments if you feel ready to live a deep, real, untamed, and not superficial faith. I want to know, have you ever felt like you were fighting something you couldn't name? Have you noticed patterns in your life that repeat themselves as if they were invisible programming? Share it with me. Your story might open the eyes of others here too. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you has been touched. Something profound, something spiritual. And this is no accident. Ordinary people don't watch a video like this until the end, but seekers do, hungry for the truth. Spiritual warriors who no longer accept living in slumber. If this is you, then you are part of our mission here on this channel. So do the following now. Subscribe to the channel, because here you don't receive superficial information. Here you receive revelation. Leave a like, because this video needs to reach others who are lost in the shadows without even realizing it. And comment below, "I fought until the end." Yes, that phrase. It's proof that you stayed, that you sought, that you're ready for the next level. And speaking of which, the next video is already on your screen. Click now. It will take you even deeper into this spiritual journey the system never intended for you to take. See you there.